Initiation by Robert Hugh Benson. Part 3, Chapter 3, Part 2. Subsection 2. By the time they had reached Elizabeth Street, Algy had succeeded in assimilating the fact. A large number of minor aspects and relations had to be adjusted, and this took a little time. It also made it extremely difficult for him to ask intelligent questions and, still more, to absorb the answers. Briefly, however, he knew the outlines of the matter. Sir Arthur had diagnosed a tumour on the brain that was the cause at once of the headaches and of the temporary blindness. This tumour must at once be removed, if indeed it was operable, for it pressed upon the optic nerves and would presumably press still more. It would be what was called a severe operation. Of course, it might be found that the tumour could not be removed, if it were in a vital spot, but an exploration at any rate must be made. The process was called trepanning or trephinning. When? Asked Algy. He suggested next Monday for the nursing home, and Tuesday morning for the operation. When a violent shock has been received, the nerves, mercifully, refuse to respond to anything else for a little while, and Algy, in spite of a consciousness that Aunt Anna would have to be told almost immediately, did not realize at all that this would probably be very unpleasant for Aunt Anna. He just regarded the fact as a man, after a bad fall from a horse, regards the blood on his hands and clothes. There it was. As the motor drew up outside the Elizabeth Street house, and the door opened as if their coming had been looked for, Neville put his hand on the other's arm. "Just take me through into the drawing room. She'll be waiting there. And then go straight on into the library and shut the door." "Right," said Algy. He had not said a word of consolation, and could not. When they came in, arm in arm, through the drawing-room door, Aunt Anna was standing on the hearthrug. Her hands were clasped behind her back, and her grey piled head was flung back, as if in defiance. She looked at them with her bright eyes, but said nothing. "Here we are," said Algy fatuously. He steered Neville past Anna, to the chintz chair that stood with its back to the light, and placed him there. "Got to go," he said, yet more fatuously. He went past Anna without looking at her, through the library door, and closed it behind him. He could hear no voices in the room he had left. He sat down miserably in the window seat, staring out into the garden. Subsection 4. By the time Aunt Anna saw them come in, she had arranged, she thought, her attitude in a completely satisfactory manner. Neville had breakfast in bed, and she had gone to his room afterwards to see him light his cigarette, and to hold the match. They had talked together, very carefully, on a completely different level from that on which they were really thinking. They had kept up a cheery sort of conversation, with even a little banter. Then she had gone out and resolutely written letters till Neville came in a little before 11, conducted by Charlson. She had jumped up and steered him to a chair, and they had talked again about when they should go back to Hartley. There had been a few desperate silences, which each made haste to break. Then, at 11:30, she had gone to the door to see them start. Then she had come back to the drawing-room and sat down. The attitude she had arranged during the hour that followed had been that suggested by Mr. Morpeth. Here the thing was. It was nobody's fault. Whatever happened, had to happen. He must not be softened by the wrong kind of tenderness. She must be quiet and businesslike and natural. Again and again during that hour, with her hands knitted tight in her lap, she had emphasized all that to herself. Yet across that interior rigidity, flashes had come and gone, of which you could not tell the nature, whether they were gleams of knowledge that a great pain was a great good if it were rightly met, or lurid streaks of horror that such a thing should come to Neville. To Neville! These she dared not stay to analyze. Then she reminded herself that perhaps all this tension was entirely unnecessary. Perhaps the verdict would be simply that Neville was overwrought in some way, that he must follow a certain diet perhaps, that he must not get up until midday for a few weeks. She knew, after all, nothing beyond what Mackenzie and Browning had told her, and they had told her very little. They did not profess to know for certain. They only guessed. For quite a long time this cheerful optimism worked beautifully. Her temperament and her mood were such that such self-suggestions as these had a great temporary effect. By 12:30 she was practically certain that there was nothing whatever the matter with Neville. They would all be laughing over it at lunch in a few minutes. Then, when the hall door opened, she sprang to her feet, and by the time that the two had slipped off their things and were coming in at the door, the whole of the tension was back again, and she was ready for anything. She could not speak one word as they entered. When the door had shut behind Algy, she turned and looked at Neville. The window was behind him, and it was a little difficult to make out his face. His eyes were closed. Then she saw that he was trying to smile. "Well, what did he say?" she asked, determined that her voice and words at least should not betray her. Neville raised his face a little, and his eyelids flickered. "Got to go through with it, my dear," he said, using the same words he had used to Algy. He had settled on them in those few seconds after the doctor had pronounced sentence. "He isn't quite certain yet, but he thinks it's a tumour. At any rate, he's got to find out." "An operation, then?" she said quietly. "That's it, next Tuesday." "Where? Here?" "No, a nursing home. He telephoned for me at once. They've got a bed all right. Got to go in on Monday." For one fierce instant, her whole emotional system shook her like a storm. A violent impulse seized her, to run to that patient, miserable figure, and kiss those dear eyes and wash them clear again. Fortunately, he could not see her face. She bit her lower lip savagely, but she could not speak. "Aunt Anna?" "Yes?" "Ah." Her voice shook ever so little. "That must not happen again. I want you to promise me something, and then I don't want to talk about it any more at all." She waited. "Do you hear, Aunt Anna? Come nearer." "I'd sooner stand. Go on, my dear, what is it?" "I want you to promise not to talk to any of the doctors behind my back. What they say to you they must say to me, do you understand?" "Yes, I promise." "That's all right then. Because there's something else. They're nearly sure it's a tumour on the brain. It's that which causes the headaches and the blindness. They want to remove that if they can. I mean, Handsworth does. But the point is, why have I got one? Well, I know all I want to know, and all that anyone must know, I mean you. No one else must know anything at all, about the reason, I mean." He spoke abruptly and spasmodically, and she could see how strong was the emotion behind. "Do you hear, Aunt Anna?" "Yes, my dear. And what is the reason?" "Do you remember what Father said to me before he died?" She had not expected this, or remembered it. It simply had not entered into her recent meditations at all. It was as if a hand had gripped her heart without warning. She could not speak. Fortunately, he did not seem to need any answer, for he went on almost immediately. "Well, it seems that there was something in it. Handsworth asked me quite plainly about my parents and so on. Asked me outright what my father had died of, what his life had been like, and so on. I told him that my father had lived wildly. Drink, everything. And then he seemed to understand." Again he paused, and again she could not speak. Back again, like a great darkness, surged the memory of a talk she had had with Mr. Morpeth, and then of another. What Neville was saying now seemed as prearranged as a play. There seemed not a detail missing. Here was pain indeed. Here was the physical suffering, and added to it a further bitterness. Here was the old curse that the old man in the country had dared to call, no, had called, the shadow of a blessing. She must hold tight to that. It must be the shadow of a blessing, or she could not bear it. The sins of the fathers, that was a law of mercy, not of wrath. She must hold to that. To love means to suffer, but love is the only joy, therefore there must be joy in suffering. Neville was talking, was he not? What was he saying? Well, he seemed to think that that explained everything. He wanted to tell me details, but I refused, and I forbade him to tell you or anyone. He promised he would not. I don't want details. Principles are all I can deal with. It is enough that I know so much. I'm weak, constitutionally, that was the word he used. That is why this thing has developed. Do you understand, Aunt Anna? Oh, do say that you understand. His voice rose nearly to a wail. She was halfway across the distance between them, driven again by that fierce impulse of love and pity before she caught herself up. She must be quiet. She must not soften him. But how in God's name did he know all this? This mystery of love and atonement? For his words surely bore no other meaning. She drew herself up then, within an arm's clasp of his patient upturned face. Oh, she must be resolute. Yet his face quivered before her eyes. My dear, I understand. Of course I understand. We will not speak of it again. Then, very gently, as her custom was, she kissed him on the forehead, above his open, unseeing eyes. He caught her suddenly in his arms.